Hi everybody, this is part 3 of our World War I module. In this segment, we're going to consider some of the problems of warfare on the Western Front. I've posted a little video clip from a British TV show called Blackadder, which I think captures a lot of the common impressions that we have about war on the Western Front, but in a pretty funny way. So I encourage you to take a look at that. We typically associate World War I with trench warfare. This was most pronounced on the Western Front. And there were a couple of factors that really shaped the reality of trench life. Much of this terrain, particularly in northern France and Belgium, is pretty low-lying terrain. It's actually much of it below sea level. So this means that the trenches are going to have constant problems with flooding and mud. They're always going to be wet. Another factor in this is that the Germans started digging in first. So they chose the better terrain, which happens to be in French and Belgian territory. The Germans have dug extensive defensive fortifications. So they have bunkers maybe 30 feet deep. They have electricity, they're carpeted, well constructed. The Allied positions are going to be significantly inferior, and the Allies are going to be forced to go on the offensive to try to drive the Germans out. And remember, this is a war in which the defense has the advantage. Both sides are going to develop very elaborate trench systems. And it wasn't just a single front line of trenches. You usually had at least 3 interlocking lines. So if you look at the diagram over here on the left, you've got your front line trench. This is where you would attack from or defend from. Then you would have another parallel trench behind that. As a support trench. So this would be a staging area for reinforcements or for equipment that you would need to repair trenches and things like that. It's also where you might have your rations and kitchens stationed. And then you would usually have a third line parallel to this even further in the rear. This would be your reserve trench. So this would be where you would have troops sent when they're going on R&R, or this is where again, you would have other supplies and equipment staged to the rear, maybe medical facilities, things like that. And then you'll also see that you have these communication trenches running perpendicular, so connecting up these 3 different levels. You'll also note that these trenches, it's not just a straight line across. There's zigzags. And the reason for that is that, let's say you're attacking and you get into the enemy line. If that's just a straight line, you can fire your machine gun straight down that line and knock out everybody. So they've done these zigzags to provide some protection here. If the enemy gets into your trench, they're not going to be able to fire down and just take out everybody. There's that turn in the trench, and the men behind that turn will be protected. So it's not just a single line of trenches. We have many, many more hundreds of miles of trenches. And remember, these have all been dug by hand, by humans. The men are not going to be on frontline duty all the time. They're going to rotate between these different levels. So you might be on the front line for a while. Sometimes you'll be stationed to the support trench as kind of support troops for the front line. Sometimes you'll be sent to the rear altogether. And you might not be in the same sector all the time either. Sometimes you're going to get transferred to a different, maybe quieter sector. And keep in mind, these men are not under constant attack all the time. Large-scale offenses are actually relatively uncommon. In fact, most men are rarely even going to see an enemy soldier, because think of it. You're not going to stick your head up above the trench unless you have to, because if you do, there's a good chance you're going to get shot. So you're keeping yourself buried most of the time. You never actually see the enemy. Typically, men will stand to attention at dawn and at dusk, because that's when attacks are considered to be most likely. But during the rest of the time, they're going to spend their duty hours either on sentry duty or fatigue duty. And fatigue is probably a pretty accurate word, because the labor that these guys are doing is just exhausting. They're digging latrines, they're hauling rations up to the front, so going back and forth between those support trenches. All of the trench fortifications have to be dug and reinforced and repaired by hand. So let's say you take an artillery attack that knocks out part of your trench line, you're going to have guys coming in and redigging that and rebracing it and putting it all back together. All the supplies that you need to do this, that wooden bracing, the barbed wire, the tools, that's all going to have to be hauled from the rear by men because these trenches are too narrow to get equipment through. And much of this is going to be done at night because it's easier to move around at night without being seen by the enemy. So you're doing a lot of this in the dark. It's very difficult to move around. The trenches are always wet. You know, you're going back and forth, you're stumbling over guys, you're slogging through water that may be knee deep, hip deep. You're worn out before you even get to the front line to do this fatigue duty. The gear you've got on is heavy. You know, your boots alone can weigh 5 pounds when they're dry, and they're very rarely dry. The greatcoats that these guys will wear, big overcoats, they weigh another 7 pounds. They're even heavier when they're wet, but you need them because that's what keeps you warm in a pretty cold climate. And keep in mind, these are not big guys. On average, these men weigh about 135 pounds. So they're not big men, but they're being called on to do a tremendous amount of labor. And you can really get a sense of the mud here in these slides. So you've got some stretcher bearers here, and you can see there's 7 guys just to carry 1 wounded man through this kind of mud. So this was pretty intense. Now, we tend to think of casualties in World War I coming from machine guns or gas attacks, these combat casualties. But in actuality, about half of World War I casualties were because of the conditions in the trenches. You're always wet, so there's major problems with a condition called trench foot. You know, your foot stays wet, and this kind of rot starts to set in, where you could potentially lose toes or even your whole foot. You see one case of it down here in the far right. You know, it was actually imperative for officers, this was really one of their most sacred duties in a way, was to inspect their men's feet every day, to make sure that their guys were taking care of their feet and trying to keep them as dry as they could, because obviously this kind of injury would render somebody unfit for duty. It's not uncommon for men to drown, believe it or not. You make an attack, you slide down into a shell hole, crater, maybe you get trapped in the mud, you just get sucked down and you can't get out. Sanitation in the trenches was a huge problem. You know, there are latrines, but think about this, you know, you're taking a heavy artillery barrage, you're scared to death. Are you gonna, you know, take the time to go find the latrine if you've got to do your business? Not likely. You also have a lot of problems with removal of bodies. Neither side had really expected casualties on this scale, and so they really had not prepared for how to remove these corpses. That's kind of an ad hoc process until later in the war. So oftentimes the dead are going to be kind of hastily buried pretty close to where they fell. And in many cases, these bodies are going to resurface over time as the weather erodes where they're buried, or perhaps shelling is going to expose bodies again. So just imagine the stench of these trenches, just the odor of death hovering over them all the time. You have massive quantities of rats that are feeding on the dead. And rats, I mean, we're talking rats on steroids. They can get as large as cats. They're feeding on the dead. They'll even attack the wounded. In fact, a lot of soldiers would keep dogs. So in this particular slide, you see some French troops with this little Jack Russell rat terrier. They would keep them specifically to go after the rats. So the rats that you see hanging here, that's what this dog has managed to kill in just 15 minutes. Because that's what rat terriers do. They catch a rat, shake it, break its neck, drop it, go to just killing machine. So you can imagine how beloved these dogs would be because they're helping these men out significantly. Also problems with lice. So these kinds of vermin can definitely spread disease and just make the men's living conditions intolerable. So the conditions in these trenches were horrendous. The full-scale major offenses that we often associate with World War I were not particularly common. What was more common was a small-scale night patrol or a trench raid. You know, just a few men being sent over the top at night to repair your barbed wire, to listen for enemy attackers, or to try to infiltrate and cut the enemy wire in preparation for an attack. But you're not typically trying to break through the enemy line every time you send a patrol over the top like this. It might be about trying to get into the enemy trench to take a captive, a prisoner, so you can get some intel, things like that. Now, the reading for this module described a British assault in the fall of 1915, one of these actual significant attacks, at the Battle of Loos. It's an excerpt from the memoir of Robert Graves, who you see here in the slide. Graves was an Englishman from kind of a middle-class English family, but he did have German relatives. He was related indirectly to German nobility. When the war broke out, Graves had been accepted to Oxford for the fall of 1914, but instead he chose to enlist in the British Army almost immediately after the declaration of war. He's going to be badly wounded in the summer of 1916 at the Somme. He almost dies of these injuries. And after the war, he becomes a poet and a scholar, and his account of World War I, called Goodbye to All of That, is one of the best accounts that we have of World War I. At the time of the episode that you read about in September of 1915, he's 20 years old. The plan that he lays out here for the British attack was pretty typical for this point in the war. At this point, commanders were still trying to push for these extensive advances. So in this case, Graves's unit was supposed to take a farm, and then they were taking a rail line, and then there was another point they were supposed to advance to beyond that. All in all, it was supposed to be as much as a mile. The attack was supposed to be preceded by a week-long artillery barrage to soften up the Germans. And then right before the attack was to go off, there was supposed to be a 40-minute gas attack to knock out any remaining German defenders, I should say. But as you wrote about in part 1 of your quiz, it all went wrong. The artillery barrage actually didn't knock the Germans out. It didn't cut the barbed wire. They're using the wrong kind of explosive shells. The gas attack failed. In fact, it actually backfired. Gas, or as Graves puts it, the accessory, the euphemism they were using for it, the British hadn't used it before. And so some of the gas units that were supposed to release the gas, they can't do it because they have the wrong size wrenches. So they can't actually turn the bolt that will release the gas. The weather conditions also don't favor the use of gas. The air is too calm. If the air is too calm, the gas is just going to sit. But when these units report this problem back to command, headquarters says, nope, accessory is to be used at all costs. So we're going to release it come hell or high water. When they release the gas, it actually ends up drifting back into the British lines. So they end up gassing themselves in this instance. So things are already bad. Just as the attack is starting, an enemy shell takes out battalion headquarters and knocks out their communications. Now think about this for a second. Battalion HQ was easily identifiable from the air. And so an enemy aircraft spots it, relays the coordinates back to their artillery, and sure enough, they take it out. Without communications from higher up, there's no good way to direct the troops at the front. So it ends up that the people calling the shots are going to be junior company officers like Graves. You know, your first and second lieutenants, your captains. These are guys who can only see what's immediately in front of them, sometimes not even that. They have no awareness of what's happening in the rest of the battle or in other sectors. They're thinking about survival and what's right in front of them. There's no way that they can coordinate a large-scale attack. And we see there's also quite a few other lesser problems. The men were already exhausting from marching through the night before the attack ever went off. You've got an officer who's a political appointee who panics and doesn't get his job done, and so a bunch of men get killed. Things like that. The problem of friendly fire. Your shells aren't landing where they're supposed to, and you're hitting your own guys. The result in Graves' portion of the attack alone was over 1,200 casualties. 25 officers killed. In fact, in one unit, he says 14 out of 16 officers are killed. So think about just the high rate of turnover that you're going to have. You know, these young men like Graves constantly being replaced, constantly being thrown into this meat grinder. I think this failed attack really highlights a lot of the difficulties of modern war. You know, the communications problems, the leadership challenges. And keep in mind that many of these problems are internal failures. These are not problems caused by the enemy. These are problems within your own force. I think it's also worth pointing out that the British actually did break through the German line here, but they couldn't follow up. They didn't have adequate, timely communication. They don't realize the extent of their gains, and the Germans managed to counterattack and drive them back before they can actually take advantage. Overall, the British in this attack are going to take 50,000 casualties. The Germans, another 25,000 casualties, and yet there's very little real result. The results of this trench stalemate and this insistence on offense and the relative parity between these combatant powers, it's going to lead to casualties on just an unprecedented scale for virtually no advantage gained. To give you a very clear case in point, the Somme offensive in the summer of 1916. The Allied High Command had planned to have British forces make a large-scale attack in the Somme River Valley. Not because there was any particular strategic target there, it was because they hoped the Germans in that sector had been worn down and they might be vulnerable. So just the effects of attrition here. Once again, the attack was supposed to be preceded by this intense artillery bombardment. So here in the slide, you see the number of shells that would have been used in 10 minutes, just an enormous amount of shell fire. After they pummel the Germans for a week, they think they'll be so destroyed and they'll just bombed out that the infantry can just go over the top, walk across no man's land, and just wipe things up. But it doesn't work. The artillery barrage fails again. They're shrapnel shells that they're firing. That's good against people, but it's not strong enough to bust bunkers. The Germans are just going to hunker down in the bunkers and wait it out. This week-long barrage kind of gives away the element of surprise, too. So the Germans know they're coming. They just dig in and wait. Most of the British infantry that are making this attack were new recruits. These were men who had been recruited into what were called PALS battalions. So they're convincing these guys to sign up by promising them, hey, that if you enlist, you'll get to serve with your buddies, with your relatives, the people that you know from your own village. The plan called for these attackers to go over the top and to advance across no man's land in ranks. This was partly because they didn't expect a lot of resistance. It was partly because these guys are so green that they believe these kinds of close order formations are going to be the only way to keep them disciplined, to keep them going forward like they're supposed to. So on July the 1st, this attack goes off. British troops go over the top, walking across no man's land carrying 60 pounds of gear. To give you a sense of just how naive some of these men were, some of the young men in the front ranks actually start out kicking soccer balls across no man's land. There were going to be prizes for the man who could kick the ball right up to the German line. And the German defenders just pop up out of their bunkers and pulverize these guys. You know, of the 120,000 attackers, 60,000 of them are casualties, 20,000 of that just in the first hour. This was the worst day in the British Army's history, and yet this battle is going to go on for another 139 days, with really no objective in mind other than attrition, just trying to grind down the enemy. And think about the impact of these losses in those PALS battalions. When a unit takes heavy casualties, it can wipe out the entire population of men in villages, entire communities. To give you an example, in one unit of 700 men, 230 of them are killed, 350 wounded in just 20 minutes. So this is going to be devastating not just to the troops, but to communities back home who are going to get those telegrams, just piles of them coming home at the same time.